I once accused my boyfriend of cheating, and it's something I still regret deeply. We had been together for nearly a year when we moved into a small house near his hometown. Life felt calm and happy until he mentioned a tradition he followed every year. On the same date annually, he would fly to California for a few days. When I asked why, he suddenly grew quiet and quickly changed the topic, instead inviting me to come with him. I couldn't take time off work that week, so I declined. I knew he was a former Marine who had been stationed there, so I assumed it was about reconnecting with old friends or revisiting memories. I didn't press him for details, at least not at first. Then something happened that unraveled me. A few days later, he was making dinner and left his phone charging in the living room where I was sitting. A message notification appeared from a name I didn't recognize. The phone was locked, but I'm ashamed to admit I already knew his passcode. It was the name of his favorite gun. I shouldn't have looked, but I had been cheated on before. My last relationship shattered my trust completely, and seeing that message reopened old wounds. The text read, "Don't forget, Maya's favorite beer is Buzz Light. Grab a few cases." My stomach dropped. Who was Maya? Why was he buying her favorite beer for a trip he wouldn't explain? I locked the phone and acted like nothing happened, but inside I was spiraling. I talked to my coworkers about it, and all of them said the same thing. He's taking another woman on a romantic trip. He's cheating. From that moment on, my anxiety took over. I couldn't sleep. I barely ate. All I could think about was how certain I'd been that he was different, and how devastated I felt believing he betrayed me. I decided I wasn't going to suffer quietly. I was going to confront him. That afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. He was outside fixing a broken fence. I called for him to come inside. When he said he'd be there in a minute, I demanded he come immediately. I heard him drop everything and rush in. When he saw my face, he instantly asked what was wrong. I looked straight at him and said, "I know you're cheating on me." He froze, then let out a small laugh, thinking I must be joking. But when he saw my tears, the smile vanished. He stepped toward me to comfort me, but I pushed him away. Quietly and clearly hurt, he asked what made me think that. I told him about Maya. I told him I knew he was flying out to see her. He nodded and said, "Yeah, I am." That broke me. I started crying uncontrollably. But then he pulled an old photo from his wallet and handed it to me. "That's Maya," he said. The photo showed two Marines in full uniform, arms around each other. One was him, younger but unmistakable. The other was a woman with a bright smile and gentle eyes. I recognized the picture. I had seen it once before in an online memorial post. Maya had taken her own life 3 years earlier while they were deployed together. He sat down and finally told me the truth. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, he flies to California to visit her grave. He spends time with her parents. He brings her favorite beer, and together they share stories about her. It's how they remember her. It's how they survived the loss. I felt sick with guilt. I had twisted his grief into suspicion. I accused him of betrayal when he was honoring someone he loved and lost. I apologized again and again, but he stayed quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me and said softly, "I should have told you. I just don't like talking about it. It still hurts." He wasn't angry, just sad, and somehow that hurt more. We talked late into the night. He told me about Maya, about the guilt he still carries, about how hard it is for him to open up. I told him about my past, about broken trust, about why I jumped to the worst conclusion. We cried together. We forgave each other. And in that painful honesty, we grew closer than ever. He still went to California the next week, but this time, I asked to come with him. He said yes. I met Maya's parents. I stood beside her grave. I watched my boyfriend grieve in a way I had never seen before. And finally, I understood what he carries with him every day. I almost ruined the best relationship of my life because I let my past dictate my present. I assumed betrayal because that's what I had always known. But he taught me something important. Not every silence hides a lie. Sometimes, it's protecting a wound that hasn't fully healed. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only person who's let old hurt contaminate something good. If your partner has parts of themselves they struggle to talk about, sometimes patience matters more than suspicion. I nearly lost everything by assuming the worst. I'm just thankful he gave me the chance to learn the truth. That week, I barely closed my laptop. I spent hours reading about survivors' guilt and military PTSD, trying to understand what he lived with every day. The articles explained how service members often carry invisible injuries, wounds that never show up on scans but quietly shape their lives. I read about combat trauma and the psychological toll of watching friends die, about how the brain tries, and often fails, to make sense of things it was never meant to endure. One article explained that many veterans struggle to explain their experiences to civilians because there simply aren't words that fit. That finally helped me understand why my boyfriend couldn't casually bring up Maya over dinner like she was just an old coworker. She wasn't a story. She was an open wound. On Wednesday afternoon, while I was reading about PTSD anniversary reactions, my phone rang. Miranda's name lit up the screen. I answered, and she asked how I was holding up, her voice careful, like she was checking on someone fragile. I told her everything. The accusation. The photo. The truth about Maya. The long night of tears and honesty that followed. She listened quietly, which was unusual for her. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said she was proud of me for admitting I'd been wrong and for apologizing, but she also reminded me that my trust issues were real and needed proper work. Understanding where they came from didn't excuse going through his phone or assuming betrayal. She was right, and it hurt to hear. The next day at work, I pulled Juliana aside during lunch. She'd been the most convinced he was cheating, the one who insisted all the signs pointed to another woman. I told her the real story about Maya and the annual trip to her grave. Juliana's face flushed with embarrassment. She apologized immediately and admitted she'd been projecting her own past onto my situation. Her ex had used similar excuses to cover an affair, so she assumed my boyfriend was doing the same. We both realized how much our pasts had distorted our judgment. She hugged me and said she was relieved to be wrong, that my boyfriend sounded like one of the rare good ones. That evening, my boyfriend came home and found me on the couch with my laptop open, reading yet another article about military grief. He set his keys down and asked what I was doing. I told him honestly that I was trying to understand what he lived through, that I wanted to understand what he carries with him every day. His expression softened, and he sat beside me. He seemed touched by the effort, but gently reminded me that reading about it wasn't the same as experiencing it. Articles could explain symptoms and psychology, he said, but they could never fully capture the feeling of losing someone that way. I told him I knew, but I wanted to try anyway. 3 days before we were set to leave for California, he pulled out his phone after dinner. He scrolled through his photos for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. There was Maya on base, pulling a ridiculous face at the camera. Another photo showed her at a barbecue, balancing a plate piled high with food. In one, she was cleaning her rifle, focused and serious. His voice stayed calm as he swiped through the pictures, but I noticed his jaw tighten with each one. It hit me that he probably didn't look at these often, and that sharing them with me wasn't easy. I asked if I could see more, and he continued scrolling, explaining where each photo was taken and what they'd been doing that day. I asked what Maya was like beyond being a Marine. He smiled faintly and told me she was hilarious, especially her spot-on impressions of their commanding officers. He said she loved pranking the new guys, nothing cruel, just enough to keep boredom away during deployment. Then he laughed quietly as he mentioned her awful singing voice, how she belt out country songs in the shower loud enough for the entire barracks to hear. As he talked, I could see flashes of the friendship they'd shared before everything fell apart. These weren't trauma memories or war stories. They were real moments with a real person he loved. The night before our flight, we were packing when he suddenly sat down on the edge of the bed. He admitted he was nervous about me meeting Maya's parents. He said they were the only people who truly understood what he lost, who knew her the way he did. I promised I'd be respectful, that I'd follow his lead, that I understood I was stepping into something sacred. He nodded and went back to packing, but the tension never fully left his shoulders. This trip wasn't just painful, it was the first time he was letting someone into this part of his life. And that carried its own weight. On the plane to California, he barely spoke. He stared out the window most of the flight, watching the clouds drift beneath us. His knee bounced non-stop, a nervous tick I'd noticed before but never this intensely. I reached for his hand and didn't try to fill the silence. I was starting to understand that support doesn't always mean talking. Sometimes it just means staying close while someone sorts through feelings they don't yet have words for. The flight attendant stopped by twice offering drinks and snacks. We declined both times. Neither of us had much of an appetite. Once we landed and picked up the rental car, his energy shifted immediately. His shoulders tightened, pulling back as if he were bracing for impact. His answers became short, single words instead of full thoughts. It was clear he'd already begun preparing himself for the emotional wait ahead. The drive from the airport felt endless. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes locked on the road. I didn't point out scenery or try to make conversation. I let the quiet do its work. About 20 minutes from Maya's parents' house, we pulled into a liquor store parking lot. He shut off the engine and went inside without hesitation. He headed straight for the beer aisle and lifted 3 cases of Buzz Light into his arms with practiced ease, like this was a ritual he'd repeated many times before. Standing there, watching him, everything finally clicked. The message that had sent me spiraling hadn't been romantic or secretive. It was tradition. It was remembrance. A way of making sure Maya was still included in moments she should have been there for. He knew exactly what her parents expected. Brand, quantity, everything. At the register, he paid in cash while I stood beside him, feeling like I was witnessing a life I'd never fully seen before. The cashier asked if we were throwing a party. My boyfriend replied flatly that we were visiting family. We loaded the beer into the trunk and drove on in silence. The neighborhoods we passed looked like any other California suburb, quiet streets, trimmed lawns, ordinary homes. But beneath that normalcy was a place where grief had settled permanently. He pointed toward a tall chain-link fence surrounding a massive complex. "That's the base," he said. We lined up there every morning at 6 for inspection. His voice carried a strange blend of warmth and pain, like fond memories tethered to loss. A few blocks later, he nodded toward a worn-down bar with a flickering neon sign. "We went there every Friday," he said. The whole unit packed into the back booths. Maya always won at pool, even drunk. I watched his face as he spoke, noticing how each memory seemed to comfort and wound him at the same time. When we turned onto a road leading toward the ocean, he slowed near a beach access. "We came here on our days off," he said. "Just sat in the sand and didn't talk about the military." He smiled faintly. Maya loved the water. Funny thing is, she grew up in Arizona. The nostalgia in his voice tightened my chest. I realized the entire city was a living map of memories, streets and buildings forever tied to someone he couldn't leave behind. Maya's parents' house was small and pale yellow with white trim. The yard was neat, and an American flag hung beside the front door. Before we even reached the walkway, the door opened and a woman hurried out. She was petite, gray-haired, wearing jeans and a Marine Corps t-shirt that looked like it once belonged to Maya. She wrapped my boyfriend in a hug, so tight it looked painful. He bent down to hold her just as tightly. A moment later, Maya's father appeared, a tall man with a military presence that hadn't faded with time. He waited until his wife stepped back, then placed a firm hand on my boyfriend's shoulder. "Good to see you, son," he said. The word son wasn't polite or casual. It was earned. Then their attention shifted to me. I felt them studying my face, trying to understand who I was and what place I held in their daughter's story. Maya's mother smiled gently and shook my hand with both of hers, warm and steady. Her father nodded and said he was glad I'd come, his tone careful, reserved. Inside the house, I immediately understood my boyfriend's anxiety. Maya was everywhere. Photos covered shelves, walls, and tables. Her entire life laid out in images. Baby Maya in a bathtub. Toddler Maya on a tricycle. Teen Maya at prom in a blue dress. Maya in dress blues at boot camp. Maya overseas in combat gear. The house wasn't decorated with memories. It was built around them. Every room felt like a tribute. The weight of their grief pressed in from all sides, making it hard to breathe. We sat in the living room while Maya's mother brought out iced tea. Her father asked about our drive. My boyfriend answered briefly, posture stiff and formal, like he was reporting for duty. Dinner was pot roast and potatoes. Comfort food Maya's mother said had been her favorite. We sat at a small table with one empty chair no one acknowledged, though everyone felt it. Maya's father asked about my boyfriend's job, our home, whether he was taking care of himself. My boyfriend answered honestly but sparingly, as if apologizing for having a life when Maya no longer could. I could hear survivor's guilt threaded through every word he spoke, the way he minimized his own happiness, as if feeling joy was something he hadn't earned. Maya's mother eventually turned her attention to me, asking how we met, what I did for a living, the usual questions that felt strangely out of place given the reason we were all there. I answered carefully, aware that I wasn't just being introduced as his girlfriend. I was being measured as someone he trusted enough to bring into this deeply personal ritual. I told them about my job, about our home, about how gentle and patient he'd been with me, even during moments when I didn't deserve that kindness. Maya's mother listened closely, nodding now and then, quietly deciding if I was worthy of the man who showed up every year to honor her daughter. After dinner, Maya's father pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses and motioned for my boyfriend to join him on the back porch. Through the kitchen window, I watched them sit side by side, leaning toward each other, speaking in voices too low to hear. 2 men bound by shared trauma and loss, exchanging words I could never fully grasp no matter how much I read about war or grief. Their conversation looked heavy, sacred even, the kind that only happens between people who have stood in the same darkness. Inside, Maya's mother and I cleaned the kitchen together, moving in quiet sync. As we wiped counters and loaded the dishwasher, she mentioned how relieved she was that he hadn't come alone this year. She worried about him making the trip by himself every time. Her compassion, despite her own unimaginable loss, made my chest ache with shame over how I twisted his grief into suspicion. I apologized again for intruding on their family tradition, but she brushed it aside, saying that anyone he loved enough to bring here was welcome. We left around 9. The drive to the hotel passed in silence. He checked us, and while I stood beside him, emotionally drained from holding myself together all evening. Once inside the room, he sat on the edge of the bed and started taking off his shoes, his hands trembling. I sat beside him and rested my hand on his back, feeling how tightly wound he was. Then he collapsed. The sobs came from deep inside him, violent, uncontrollable, the kind of crying that feels almost animal. I wrapped my arms around him and held on, not trying to stop it or fix it, finally understanding that some pain just needs to be felt in the presence of another person. He cried for nearly 20 minutes, gasping between sobs, his entire body shaking against mine. When he could finally speak, he told me he felt guilty for surviving when Maya didn't. Guilty for finding happiness with me when she never would. The weight of that guilt was crushing, illogical, and all-consuming, and I realized he'd been carrying it alone for 3 years. He kept apologizing for breaking down, for bringing me with him, for being a mess. I kept telling him to stop apologizing for being human. Then he began talking about Maya in ways he never had before. He told me she'd been struggling long before she died. There had been signs, comments about not wanting to be here anymore that everyone brushed off as dark humor. He blamed himself for not pushing harder, for not checking in more, for not preventing what now felt obvious in hindsight, even though no one could have truly known. I shared my own truth with him, about the messages I'd found on my ex's phone that he claimed were work-related, about the months of being told I was paranoid and jealous, while my instincts screamed otherwise, about coming home early one day and finding proof I couldn't ignore, and being blamed for his betrayal. He listened quietly, his breathing steady in the dark. When I finished, I told him I knew my past wasn't his fault, but it was why I saw betrayal in a text about beer instead of grief. Why I accused him of cheating when he was honoring someone he loved. He was silent for a long time. Then he admitted he'd been locking parts of himself away, so I wouldn't have to see how dark things got. He said he tells people he's fine when he isn't, that the nightmares still wake him soaked in sweat and disoriented. I confessed that I'd been searching for signs of betrayal in everything he did, because expecting the worst felt safer than being blindsided again. We talked until the room slowly filled with early morning light. Neither of us slept. Both of us finally said the things we'd been too afraid to admit. He told me he'd been protecting me by pulling away instead of letting me see him struggle. I admitted I'd been testing his loyalty without realizing it, looking for proof that my fears were justified. When morning came, the heaviness returned instantly. He moved through getting dressed like his body was functioning on autopilot, his face blank in a way that frightened me more than the tears had. I got ready quietly, unsure if words would help or harm. We checked out and drove back to Maya's parents' house, where they waited on the porch with flowers already in hand. The four of us climbed into their car, my boyfriend and I in the back seat with the cases of Buzz Light beer between us. No one spoke during the 20-minute drive to the cemetery. The silence felt dense, suffocating, like the air itself understood the significance of the day. Outside the window, life went on as usual. People moved through ordinary moments on a day that felt anything but ordinary to us. When we arrived, the military cemetery stretched endlessly in every direction, row after row of identical white headstones set into flawless green grass. We parked and followed Maya's parents along a familiar path, one they clearly knew by heart. The rows of headstones blurred together until we stopped in front of one that looked identical to all the rest, except for the name carved into it. Maya's full name, her rank, the dates that marked the beginning and the end of her life. Her father knelt and gently placed the flowers at the base of the stone. Her mother set down a small framed photo of Maya in uniform, smiling brightly at the camera. My boyfriend stood frozen, staring at the grave with such naked anguish on his face that I had to look away to keep from breaking down. His jaw was locked tight, his hands clenched at his sides, like he was physically holding himself together. Maya's father opened one of the beers and slowly poured it onto the grass in front of the headstone, the liquid disappearing into the soil. Her mother opened another and did the same. The gesture was simple, but it carried immense weight. My boyfriend took the third beer with trembling hands and poured it out as well, his lips moving silently as if he were speaking words meant only for her. Then they each opened beers for themselves, and the four of us stood there quietly, drinking together, as though Maya were still part of the circle. After a few moments, her father began telling a story from basic training about how Maya convinced another recruit to help her hide all of their drill sergeant's whistles as a prank. Soft laughter broke through tears as he described the sergeant's confusion when he couldn't find a single one. My boyfriend added that Maya nearly got kicked out for it, but somehow talked her way out of serious punishment. I could hear the affection in his voice, tangled tightly with grief. More stories followed, each one filling in another piece of who Maya had been. Her mother talked about her disastrous attempts at cooking, how everyone learned to eat beforehand if Maya was hosting. My boyfriend shared a story about her winning a poker tournament on base and trash-talking men twice her size. Her father laughed through tears as he described Maya winning a push-up contest against the entire platoon, refusing to quit even when her arms were visibly shaking. They opened more beers. The memories flowed. For moments at a time, Maya felt vividly present, alive in their words, which somehow made her absence hurt even more. Then my boyfriend stepped closer to the headstone and lowered himself onto one knee. He reached out and traced the letters of Maya's name with his fingertips, moving slowly, reverently, like he was trying to reach her through the stone. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet I could barely hear him at first. He told her about me, about how we met, about how terrified he'd been to let anyone get close again after losing her. His voice broke when he apologized for waiting 3 years to bring someone to meet her. He said he'd been afraid she might think he was replacing her, or forgetting what she meant to him. He promised her parents that he would keep coming back every year, no matter how his life changed, no matter how much time passed. The pain in his voice made my chest ache so badly, I had to press a hand against it just to breathe. Tears streamed down his face as he kept talking to her like she could hear him. He told her he missed her every single day, that the guilt of surviving when she didn't still woke him up at night. Watching him unravel there made me understand what he meant about carrying this weight every day. This wasn't distant grief that had dulled with time. It was raw and ever-present, sitting just beneath the surface of everything he did. After a while, he stood again, staring down at her name, tears still falling, jaw clenched tight as he tried to pull himself back together. Maya's mother stepped closer to me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. In a quiet voice meant only for me, she said she was grateful he had me now, that Maya would want him to be loved and happy. Her words shattered me. Here was a woman who had buried her daughter, who came to the cemetery every year to pour beer on her grave, and she was worried about whether the man her daughter loved had someone to care for him. That was when I finally cried. The tears came fast and uncontrollably. She squeezed my shoulder and said nothing else, just stayed beside me while we watched my boyfriend grieve for the woman he couldn't save. We remained there for over an hour, none of us wanting to be the one to suggest leaving. The sun felt too bright, too ordinary, for how heavy everything was. The world kept moving. People walked dogs along the paths, birds sang in the trees, cars passed beyond the gates, completely unaware of the weight we were carrying. Eventually, Maya's father said it was probably time to head back before it got too late. We walked back to the car in silence, emotionally drained in a way that went far beyond physical exhaustion. My boyfriend held my hand tightly, almost painfully, but I didn't pull away. I knew he needed the connection. Back at Maya's parents' house, we sat in the living room surrounded by photographs of their daughter everywhere we looked. The walls and shelves told the story of her life. Family moments, friendships, her years in uniform. Maya's mother made sandwiches, and we shared more memories, though no one really ate. The conversation drifted naturally between laughter and tears, past and present, following the unpredictable rhythm of grief. One moment, Maya's father was laughing about how she once convinced her entire unit to wear their uniforms backward for a group photo. The next, he was crying into his hands. My boyfriend began telling another story about Maya teaching herself guitar by watching videos online, his voice soft, steady, and full of love. He joked that she'd play the same 3 chords over and over until everyone was ready to toss her guitar off the roof. Maya's mother laughed and said the guitar was still in the closet, that she'd never been able to part with it, even though no one played it anymore. Then Maya's father stood and said he wanted to play something. He went to the closet and returned with Maya's guitar, the very one from all the stories. He sat down and began to play, his voice rough but steady as he sang. My boyfriend closed his eyes, listening, tears sliding down his face without any attempt to hide them. For once, he was allowing himself to feel everything in front of people who understood, people who wouldn't rush him, judge him, or ask why he wasn't over it yet. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long moment. As the light outside shifted into a warm golden glow, Maya's mother asked if she could speak with me privately. We stepped into the kitchen, and she turned to me with tears in her eyes. She thanked me for coming, for standing by him, for being patient with his grief. She said he'd carried this alone for far too long, and that she was relieved he'd finally trusted someone enough to share it. She told me she could see how much he loved me, and that it gave her hope he might someday truly heal instead of simply surviving. I didn't have the right words, so I hugged her. We cried together in the kitchen, while the men sat in the living room, surrounded by Maya's memory. Before we left for the hotel, I surprised everyone by asking if I could spend a moment alone at Maya's grave. They exchanged uncertain looks but agreed. My boyfriend drove me back to the cemetery and waited in the car while I walked to her headstone on my own. The sun was setting, and the cemetery was nearly empty. Standing there felt awkward at first, speaking to someone I'd never met, but then the words came. I apologized out loud for my jealousy and suspicion, for twisting her memory into something dark in my mind. I promised to take care of him and never make him feel ashamed for grieving her. I told her that loving me would never mean forgetting her or erasing the pain he still carried. I admitted I'd almost ruined something good because I couldn't see past my own trauma. I explained how my ex's betrayal had destroyed my ability to trust, how seeing her name in that message had triggered wounds I hadn't fully healed. I said I was grateful I'd been given the chance to learn the truth instead of losing him to my assumptions. I promised to honor her memory by being worthy of the trust he placed in me by doing my own healing so my past wouldn't poison our future. I stayed there a little longer, staring at her name etched in stone, thinking about the life she never got to live, the love, the milestones, the growing old that was taken from her. Then I walked back to the car where my boyfriend waited. He drove us back to the hotel in silence. The sun had fully set, and the streetlights painted everything in a strange orange glow. When we parked, he didn't get out right away. He sat with his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. I waited, unsure what to say after everything we'd been through. Eventually, he took a deep breath and opened his door. We walked to the room together, the weight of the day heavy between us. Inside, he sat on the edge of the bed and buried his face in his hands. I sat beside him and placed my hand on his back. He leaned into me, wrapping his arms around my waist and holding on like he was afraid to let go. When he pulled back, his eyes were red and exhausted. He told me he was grateful I came with him, that making this trip alone for so many years had been unbearable. He admitted he'd been scared to let me see the side of him because most people don't know how to handle grief like this. They grow uncomfortable, try to fix it, or insist it's time to move on. He was afraid I'd see him as broken or too damaged to love fully. I told him I finally understood why he couldn't bring this up casually. This wasn't small talk. Loving someone meant seeing all of them, the hurt, the scars, and the parts still healing. His grief no longer scared me because I finally understood it. We talked late into the night about how we both needed to heal individually while supporting each other. He admitted he'd been going to counseling through the VA, but hadn't been fully honest about how deeply the survivor's guilt still affected him. He said he talked around the pain instead of confronting it. When I asked why, he said it felt easier to manage the hurt than to truly face it. I told him that wasn't fair to himself, and that real healing meant opening the door, not keeping it shut. He agreed, and said he'd try to be more honest in his next session. Then I admitted I needed help too. I told him I needed a therapist to work through my trust issues, that it wasn't fair to either of us for me to live in constant fear because of what someone else had done. He supported me without hesitation, and even offered to help me find someone. That night, in that quiet hotel room, we made a promise to each other, to be more open about our wounds and triggers. He promised to share his difficult days instead of withdrawing. And I promised to speak up about my fears instead of letting them silently control me. Instead of letting them quietly turn into accusations. The rest of our time in California passed slowly and gently. We spent another afternoon with Maya's parents, sharing stories that felt lighter this time, still sad, but threaded with warmth. When it was time to say goodbye, Maya's mother hugged my boyfriend tightly, and then hugged me too, whispering that she was glad we had found each other. Maya's father clasped my boyfriend's shoulder and told him to keep living, really living, not just surviving year to year. On the flight home, my boyfriend's knee still bounced, but less violently. He leaned his head against the window, exhausted but calmer, like something heavy had finally shifted inside him. I rested my head on his shoulder, and for the first time since we'd met, I felt like I truly understood the man beside me, not just who he was now, but what he carried with him. Life didn't magically become perfect after that trip. He still had hard days. Anniversaries still hit him like a wave. Nightmares didn't disappear overnight. And I still had moments where my anxiety flared, where old fears whispered worst-case scenarios into my mind. But now we talked about it. When he felt the weight creeping in, he told me instead of pulling away. When my fear started spiraling, I said it out loud instead of letting it rot silently. We learned that healing isn't a straight line. It's a series of honest conversations, apologies, patience, and choosing each other again and again. He followed through with therapy, opening up about Maya in ways he never had before. I found a therapist of my own and started untangling the damage my past had left behind. Some sessions were painful. Some left me drained. But for the first time, I wasn't running from the work. Every year now, when that date comes around, we talk about it ahead of time. Sometimes we go to California together. Sometimes he goes alone, and I support him from home. I never question why. I never read meaning into silence anymore. Because I understand now. Loving someone doesn't mean being the only important person in their life. It means respecting the people and losses that shape them. It means trusting that grief and love can exist side by side without threatening what you share. I almost lost the best thing in my life by letting old wounds speak louder than truth. I mistook quiet pain for secrecy and remembrance for betrayal. But grace, his grace, gave me a second chance. And I learned something I'll carry forever. Not every unanswered question is a lie. Not every silence hides betrayal. Some are simply the echoes of love that never got the chance to finish its story.